Okay. Hejsan på dejsan. I'm Erica Druger reporting to you from Sweden. Today I'll be talking about how to analyze reindeer avoidance of human developments in Sweden by using an approach from the Canadian Recovery Plan. Reindeer fur, also known as reindeer or caribou, are an excellent indicator of ecosystem effects. They have a large spatial and temporal movement across the landscape and are very sensitive to disturbance effects. They respond to disturbances, such as roads, mines, power lines, for example, by avoiding these objects. And the areas that we can place around these types of disturbance to indicate their effect on reindeer and other ecosystem factors are called disturbance buffers, and that's what we're going to look at today. So first I started my analysis by assessing methods from Canada. The Canadian Caribou Recovery Plan, produced in 2012, gave me an idea about a method called disturbance buffers. They did a large analysis to come up with a 500-meter buffer around disturbances. And just to describe to you what that means, this is an image of a reindeer area with a road running through it, and finally a 500-meter buffer around that road. So the area from the road, which is green here, is essentially an area that is made unavailable for reindeer use, and that's what a buffer is. The next step I took in the analysis was to compare the Swedish system to the Canadian one. We use a system called land use plans for reindeer husbandry, which started here, close to Umea, where I am, in a reindeer district called Vilhelmina Norra. These plans take herder-defined areas, so information directly from reindeer herders, to tell us about disturbance effects on the landscape, and to tell us where we're going to find reindeer on the landscape as well. But a knowledge gap that I identified in these plans is the idea of disturbance buffers. They haven't defined any yet. So I wanted to adapt and test methods from the Canadian Caribou Recovery Plan and apply them in the Swedish reindeer husbandry system. I did that first by completing an avoidance literature review. That was literature from all over the world related to reindeer and caribou. Then I wanted to apply the buffers that I found through this review directly into an area in Sweden. After I did that, I came to the conclusion that we need to create new buffers because it's not very applicable to apply ones that were created for a different system in Sweden. And I'll show you why in a second. And I wanted to do that using these herder-defined areas that that a group of scientists, I should say, came up with through reindeer land use plans. So I focused on one small area in northern Sweden, a little bigger than 3,000 kilometers squared. It's called Gabna Reindeer Husbandry District, and it's located just north of the city of Kiruna and north of a very large underground copper mine operated by LKAB. I chose to focus on the southern part of the range, the seasonal winter range, because it has so many different types of disturbance that we could actually look at. It has the mine, a large population center, roads, power lines, railroads, and quite a lot of forestry, which are these polygons here, the white. And also because seasonal winter range is such a critical time for reindeer in order to survive the year and to continue to thrive, just because resources are very limited. So it was particularly interesting to look at this area because of those reasons. And then I took herder-defined high-use areas. So these red areas, they were collected through this land use planning procedure from scientists and reindeer herders. And they show the most critical habitat for reindeer within these winter range areas. So the first step that I took was to visualize what buffers from literature looked like in the Gabna landscape. So here we have roads within Gabna and population centers. This is Kiruna here, and then a few smaller ones in the south. I wanted to apply the Canadian buffer of 500 meters along all disturbances. Here I just show you two, but I did it for all. This is along roads and population centers again. And then finally, I took the highest buffer that I could find from literature and I applied them to different disturbances. So the highest buffer I found for roads was 5 kilometers on both sides of the road. This is what 5 kilometer buffer would look like. Now I can't move my camera, but this is the image of a 12 kilometer buffer around population centers. And a little bit where my picture is, there's only a very small blue area left, which would be considered available area after we apply these disturbance buffers. So when we see those images, it's possible to come to the conclusion that we can't just take buffer areas from other places which are designed for different systems and apply them here. It just doesn't work. It would tell us that there's no available habitat for reindeer, which we know isn't necessarily true. So I wanted to develop my own avoidance analysis to come up with new buffers for Gabna, and that could be applied for other reindeer husbandry districts in Sweden as well. And I did that by using a method called resource selection functions, found commonly in literature for wildlife studies and used by the Canadian Recovery Plan as well. This is a binomial generalized linear model that explains habitat and habitat preferences of wildlife by looking at environmental variables and outputting a binomial response, whether these areas are used or not by the wildlife. We can also get buffer distances around disturbances by inputting distance around disturbance as one of our environmental variables. So what I did now was I took that method and I placed random points within the herder-defined areas that I talked about earlier, and also on the outside of them. So those were my environmental variables, and I wanted to predict, using a model, which areas would be high use and which areas would be other use. So for each point here, I'd extracted the distance from each type of disturbance. Here you can see it's a raster image with proximity. And when I placed the point there, I extracted, therefore, the distance behind that point to the nearest road. The same thing goes for the ones that were outside and for each type of disturbance. I placed a limit on the distance from each type of disturbance that I would include in the model. The reason being that I found some very large distances away from certain types of disturbance, which didn't really represent avoidance, but rather just showed that these high-use areas were very, very far from these disturbances. I looked at correlations using Handel, Tau, and Spearman, first among the different types of disturbances, to make sure that I wasn't including more than one disturbance in a model that showed actually the same thing. For example, roads and power lines ran very close together, so I didn't want to include both. They were highly correlated. And then I chose my variables by using Spearman correlations to make sure that the high-use areas were actually correlated with distance from disturbance. I fit my model, taking into account those correlations, and I picked the lowest AIC value, which is Aikaiki's information criterion value, to find the best fit model. Finally, my best model included roads, population centers, and railroads. And I got some interesting results from the model, which were not expected from literature. So we would expect roads to have an average of a 3 kilometer buffer of avoidance by reindeer. And then population centers would be avoided up to 8 kilometers away by reindeer. And what our model actually showed us was that roads and population centers had high-use areas very close to them. They almost favored these disturbances rather than having buffer distances around them. And that could be so for a number of reasons. Roads and lichens tend to pop up in the same areas, these high, dry areas on the landscape. So road engineers and reindeer like kind of the same things. That's maybe why we're getting this relationship between roads and high-use areas. as in the same area. Also, it might be possible that roads are located on traditional routes. Because these areas were already used for migration by the herders and the reindeer, it was very easy to put roads into those areas. Another reason could be that the most important areas, which are defined by herders, are close to population centers and other disturbances just because they are so rare and they are so threatened. And these are human factors that go into using herder-defined data as well. So there could be a bias in using this type of data. Potential study design or system issues that I came across. These large high-use areas, which are the large red areas here to the south and the north near the town center, these really were overrepresented in my model because I had many random points within them just because they were so large. The disturbances that ran within those high-use areas gave me results saying that these areas really favored those disturbances, and that's a problem for the model. I also made some faulty assumptions. I assumed that reindeer used these high-use areas very evenly across them, when in reality there could be avoidance going on within those high-use areas as well, and the location of the use area doesn't actually show me much about avoidance. Gabna has very highly densified disturbances, and so movement and avoidance by reindeer could very well be restricted so that we're not able to pick it up in this type of analysis. And it could be so that reindeer are also much more used to human disturbance in a way that wild caribou or wild reindeer are not in different parts of the world. Finally, there are some unique opportunities that came out of the study, an exchange of methods between Canada and Sweden. So for example, in Canada, they're really leading in disturbance detection, disturbance management as far as caribou. Whereas in Sweden, there's a lot more emphasis on integrating this indigenous knowledge into management and into science. So by putting those two together, we could have a much stronger system in both areas. And I wanted to just comment on a recent study that's come out. It's kind of exciting for me. It's by Polfus et al. It's going to be cut off there a little bit. And it's in collaboration with the Taku River Tlingit First Nation, which is in northern British Columbia. They ran a similar resource selection function model, and they took traditional ecological knowledge and established a model based on that for figuring out where you would find caribou across the landscape. And they came out with a result that really both models were quite good at predicting where you would find them. So this is just another case for including traditional or indigenous knowledge into science and using them collaboratively to understand more about reindeer movement across the landscape and avoidance of disturbance. So that's my presentation. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed. Congratulations to you that have already finished, and good luck to those of you that are working hard. So see you later.